So today will be once again a continuation of our webinar series that is being done in lieu of a conference in 2022. We will once again reconvene in Vancouver, BC, May 16th to the 18th in 2023. So please do make sure to mark all of those dates as we have a compelling and very fascinating conference being planned. Throughout the webinar, we will accept typed questions and comments that are submitted through the chat functionality. However, the panelists will be answering the questions at the end of the presentation. This presentation and this webinar will be recorded and will be made available at our YouTube channel. We may also provide an online evaluation form after the webinar ends, so please take a look out for that. This webinar is a very exciting and well-needed discussion. What we plan to do at CMBS is to kickstart the discussion officially today, where our speakers will talk about the right to repair progress made from the United States perspective. In the new year, we aim to have a right to repair conversation from the European lens and also the Canadian lens as well. And we hope to sort of culminate that or that initial discussion in a town hall style discussion at the conference, which we'll have in Vancouver. So once again, a plug to the conference. Please make sure to register the conference. The concept of right to repair stems from the fact that users of equipment ranging from tablets to tractors to ventilators can't fix their own stuff because manufacturer impose restrictions on repair. We've helped build the right to repair movement to address these problems by channeling the frustrations of biomeds, fixers, small business owners, farmers, environmentalists into more concrete legislative change. So in this session, we will be looking at the problems of planned obsolescence, the solution that right to repair provides, and the ways that we've started to win this fight. That's what the session will be about today. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to Michael to introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah, we have a series of really good talks on this topic, which is critical to all of us. Excellent speakers today. First, we have Binseng, or he'll actually be speaking second, but I'll introduce him first. So Binseng Wang is Vice President Program Management with Sodexo Healthcare Technology Management. And that's a leading medical equipment independent service organization in the US. And I'm sure everyone will recognize with Binseng's name from many years of excellent service and support of our clinical engineering through his long career. Previously, Dr. Wang was Vice President Quality and Regulatory Affairs for Sundance Enterprises, Aramark Healthcare Technologies, as well as Medic PRN. He has also worked as a visiting scientist at NIH and adjunct professor at the Milwaukee School of Engineering, as well as in Brazil. He is a fellow of the ACCE as well as AIMBE, and he was inducted into the Clinical Engineering Hall of Fame by ACCE in 2017. Well done, Binseng. He earned a Doctor of Science degree from MIT and is a certified clinical engineer. So very happy to have Binseng here today. First up, though, we actually have presenting Kevin O'Reilly, and he is the Right to Repair Campaign Director at the Public Interest Research Group, the PRIG. He has worked with hundreds of biomeds, hospitals, and ISOs, as well as professional societies from across the US to push for medical right to repair legislation at the state and federal level. So we kind of want to check in with them because we actually have legislation that's going through a Canadian Parliament process as well. So his work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Market Watch, Political, and many more instances. So hearty welcome to both of you. And Kevin, I turn the floor to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Adil. Thanks, everybody, for having me on. It's really great to be talking with you. And, you know, obviously I can't match Binseng's list of credentials, but nonetheless, what I want to talk about a little bit more is right to repair, not only in the medical sense, but also kind of place this medical right to repair push within the broader movement that's happening, across the world, really, whether it's in Canada, in the United States, or in lots of other countries, as we'll see. So looking forward to share a little bit on that and discuss that. And, one other thing I want to say, right, is I first had the opportunity to meet Kevin Taylor. We were over in Italy, where this, again, is an issue that clinical engineers and biomeds are thinking about. And he shared some of the stories of what it's like when a piece of equipment breaks down in the North Country, right? And you don't have access to the service keys or the repair parts or manuals that you need, and you're waiting for sometimes a helicopter delivery of those materials with the manufacturer representative. That's just not a good option. So I know this is something that y'all deal with on a regular basis. So I want to just fill in some of the gaps as far as what this looks like across industries and how we're starting to make progress. So Adil, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide. Great. So that's me. That's my face. I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm actually in North Carolina because we've got another hearing that's going on. So I apologize for not joining my face with y'all. But as I mentioned earlier, right, a lot of my focus is on medical equipment and working with hospitals and biomeds and clinical engineers and ISOs and all of the above to try and make some change. So we'll go to the next slide, Adil. And just a quick overview of our organization. So PIRG, right, is the Public Interest Research Group. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit public interest advocacy organization. And so what we work to do is to implement changes that will lead to better consumer protection, better environmental protection, prioritize public health and good governance and those kind of things. And so we operate both in Washington, D.C., trying to pass federal legislation, but also, at the state level, it has been a big focus of ours. And you can see those are some of the states that we currently operate in. So we'll go to the next slide. Great. So let's start from the very beginning, right? Right to repair is about two really basic ideas, right? First of all, when you own something, you should be able to do what you want with it. And second of all, when something breaks, we should fix it. So I think right to repair is all about making sure that we can fix our stuff when it breaks, right? And there are a whole host of reasons that we should be able to do that, from just kind of the agency of ownership, but also environmental implications, cost savings implications for families, especially as inflation becomes, a problem. And, there are those kind of issues. Also, with supply chains disruptions, we need to be able to keep our stuff working because there's no guarantee that you'll be able to get a new one right when you need it. So that's a little bit about right to repair. But on the next slide, right, I know that many of you likely fix things in your day-to-day work life, but I challenge you now to think about the last time that you fixed something, in your day-to-day life, just at home. So whether that was replacing a light bulb, I'll give you credit for that. But maybe you fixed a household appliance like a dishwasher, or you changed the oil in your car, or something to that degree. And as you're thinking about that, think about the last time that happened. When we do this, when I kind of discuss this in person, one thing I like to do is have people raise their hands and say whether they fixed something last year, last 6 months, last month, last week, right? And the hands start to drop pretty progressively. I would think that if we were to ask that question, say 20, 50, 70 years ago, right, you would see hands raised throughout the entire period, because the fact of the matter is that in many ways our society has kind of moved away from repair. And so on the next slide, right, one big issue is that we have turned into somewhat of a throwaway society. And I know this is especially the case in the United States, but I think it's something we're seeing globally, where we used to value things. We used to, repair them when they broke, refurbish them when that needed to happen, repurpose them even if they no longer were fulfilling their original purpose. And only, at the very end of its possible life cycle, we throw things away. I know my grandparents lived through the Depression in the United States, and so they held on to things like rubber bands for as long as they possibly could. Whereas now, if your phone screen breaks, that's a good excuse to get a new one. If say your wireless headphones, the battery dies out, why not just upgrade? And so we've become this much more kind of consume society, and that has big problems. First of all, for our environment. So on the next slide, there are one reason that this is happening is because of the really proliferation of software in everything we use, whether that is a tablet or a toaster or a farmer's tractor, right? There's software in everything. And that's a good thing in many ways. It allows us to, I can be a part of this call from my phone. That's excellent. But it also gives manufacturers an opportunity to take control of the repair process. And that's what we see very often. And so one of the things that happens is they drive what's called planned obsolescence, right? In addition, by restricting repair, they can also get you to buy new things more often so that you're replacing your phone every 2 years rather than holding on to it for a long time. And so that's kind of a big aspect of this. So on the next slide, like I mentioned, right, there are big environmental impacts, and it really happens across 3 different portions of a device's life cycle. So first of all, there's the extraction, there's the processing, the production, and then the disposal. So on the next slide, right, when you think about extraction, the rare earth metals, and go again, Adil, sorry about that, power our devices often come from places like Chile and Bolivia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where that leads to soil and water contamination, air pollution, not to mention human rights abuses. But even when we do those kind of things domestically or in North America, the mining process involves digging a giant crater into the earth, all to remove finite materials that will not last forever, right? They're going to run out. So, it has to be done to a certain degree, but we can't continue to go back to the well over and over and over again. So the next part of the process on the next slide is the processing. And so using laptops as an example, right, there are a huge number of laptops that are manufactured every single year. What that produces, that 150.6 billion pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent, is the same as 15 million cars running on road for a year. So that is a significant emissions impact, especially as we're facing the climate crisis that we are currently under. So that's another aspect of this. And then the third part is something that I think people often associate with repair, is the disposal aspect, right? Because it's that part of the life cycle you're seeing it go. And so, for one, e-waste is a relatively small part of, at least in the United States, but this is kind of generally true across the world, of our waste stream. It's only 2%. It is the fastest growing, but still small. But nonetheless, it is incredibly toxic. As you can see, it accounts for 70% of the United States waste stream's toxicity. And those toxic materials are getting leached into our soil, leached into our water. It's causing all sorts of problems. And, I should note, right, recycling is important, and e-waste recycling, unfortunately, just isn't very efficient right now. That's in part because of the use of, glue in our devices rather than fasteners like screws, which make it more difficult to bring apart. It also goes back to this problem of right to repair, where manufacturers aren't providing schematics, and they aren't providing all of the materials needed to disassemble these devices. So, in many cases, e-waste recyclers just have to shred the devices rather than be able to get all the cobalt and the copper and the gold and et cetera out of the devices that are being thrown away. So they just end up in the landfill. And that's really a shame. It's really too bad. So on the next slide, right to repair is, has an important environmental argument, as we've mentioned, but it's also a huge deal for consumers. So I want to talk about kind of 2 particular categories of consumers that this affects. And so on the next slide, we've got some information from a report that we put out, some research that we did a year or 2 ago. And we looked at a few common household devices, right? It was, I think, a laptop, a vacuum cleaner, a few other, devices that many people across the United States use. And what we found is that on average, American families could save $330 per year by opting for repair rather than replacement of those common devices, which added up to a total of $40 billion. That's a significant amount of savings. I mean, $330 isn't gonna, that's not a huge windfall, but as budgets get tight, that's incredibly important and an important aspect of right to repair. And then on the next slide, the other thing is that consumers just want this, right? So this was a survey that was done in the EU, and I think that top left stat is pretty important, where almost 2 out of 3 consumers want their devices to last for at least 5 years. I have to say, I recently upgraded my iPhone 7, which I was holding on to with white knuckle grip as long as I could. It eventually just got to the point where it couldn't last, but I was able to hold on to it for 7 years, I think 6 or 7 years. It required a couple battery replacements. It requires some repair, and thank goodness that iPhones are so widespread that you can find many, crowdsourced repair materials online from groups like iFixit, who's another leader in the right to repair movement, who we work very closely with. But nonetheless, right, this is something that people want. They want to be able to fix their stuff. They don't like having to go and buy these things over and over and over again. And then let's go to the next slide. The other group of consumers that I want to talk about is farmers, right? And so farmers have been a huge part of the Right to Repair campaign, both in the United States as well as in Canada. I've had the opportunity to work with some folks up there. And so this here is a picture of Jared Wilson. He is a farmer in Missouri, which is kind of in the Midwest, southern area of the United States. He tends, I think, 20,000 acres, growing wheat and hay and all sorts of things. And Jared has become a good friend of mine, and he's also become a huge advocate for repair reform because he's frankly just fed up. He has had situations in which his equipment has gone down, and he's had to wait for 32 days while his equipment was sitting in the dealership waiting for a repair. That was simply because he didn't have access to the software needed to diagnose the problem. He didn't have access to hydraulic diagrams. Turned out it was a problem with his hydraulics and a valve. And so he was just at the mercy of the manufacturer, of the dealership. Those 32 days, he estimates that this happened at the beginning of planting season a couple years back, and he estimates that he loses somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 every single day he doesn't get seed in the ground. So 32 days now, it turned out that weather didn't mean that he was missing all 32 of those days, but nonetheless, he estimates he lost a significant amount of his yield and therefore significant amount of profit, right, in his ability to make a livelihood and produce the food that ultimately goes on our tables. So after figuring out what the problem was, when the dealer finally did make the fix, it was a simple valve problem. He thinks that if he had the hydraulic diagram and the like, he would have been able to do that in no more than 2 days. So farmers are frustrated. I think, like many of you likely are, and I know many of the clinical engineers and biomeds I work with are, they've got the know-how, they've got the will to do the thing, to make the repair, but manufacturers get in the way. And so let's go to the next slide. We'll go ahead and skip this one and the next one, Adil. Great. And so, this coalition pushing for right to repair, it includes medical professionals like yourself, it includes farmers, it includes environmentalists, it's tinkerers, it's DIYers, it's end-of-life processors. It's this scrappy coalition that, first of all, spans all ideological spectrums, right? In the United States, majorities of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans all support this issue. But it's also growing immensely at the global level, right? As you can see, there is action happening in Canada and the United States, but also all over the world, because people are frustrated. They want to be able to fix their stuff. And it's not a crazy ask. It's something that we can absolutely get done, and we need to get done. And so it's been really amazing to watch as this has popped up across the country, with India adopting a right to repair framework of their own, New Zealand launching their own campaign in the past year trying to get this done, folks in Australia also kind of leading the edge. And so I think that's an important thing to remember, because this can be frustrating, it's difficult, but it's good to know that this is something that people across the world are taking up. Let's go to the next slide. Awesome. And so I quickly want to just touch on 2 different approaches that are being taken when it comes to right to repair. So let's start with the EU, and you can cycle through 2 slides here, Adil. What they have focused on is consumer education, right? So basically, they have implemented in France, for example, a rating that determines how much or how repairable a device is, which consumers will be able to see right on the device's packages when they're buying something and be able to make a choice about it in the process. Now, in the US, if we go through a couple slides here, Adil. Next one. We have taken a different approach, and I think this is particularly important for medical devices. Oh, let's go back one. Sorry, is requiring manufacturers to provide the materials necessary to make repair possible. So that means replacement parts, it means repair tools, it means also repair information. So that's spans from schematics, service manuals, repair manuals, but also the software tools that are necessary, the service keys that are necessary to go in and diagnose and authorize repairs as they're going. So on the next slide, right? I think right to repair. I think we can all agree, and that this is a common sense idea. We should be able to fix our stuff. What's the holdup? Well, the fact of the matter is, we're up against titans of industry. Frankly, these are the biggest companies in the world oppose right to repair because they have a vested interest in making sure that they can continue to monopolize the repair market, that they can count on those repair revenues. And so we did some research and found that companies worth a combined $10.7 trillion, some of which are pictured here, lobbied against right to repair in the United States. That is a huge number, and that comes with incredible amounts of resources to devote to lobbying and access to lawmakers. But the fact of the matter is, nonetheless, our scrappy coalition is winning. And so on the next slide, it is this coalition that spans countries, that spans ideological spectrums, it spans different industries and different interests, and all of that grassroots support has built us some allies in really important places in the United States. So on the next slide, the guy on the left, I'd imagine you might recognize. President Joe Biden has been a vocal advocate for right to repair, including issuing a executive order calling for action on it. And then on the right, that is Chairwoman Lena Khan of the Federal Trade Commission. That's essentially our competition bureau. The FTC has taken some significant action against companies like Harley Davidson, Westinghouse Generators, most recently also going to take up a rule to make sure that appliances are more fixable. And I had the opportunity to meet with her a couple months ago, and what she led the meeting with is that she said that the commission is doing everything they can to signal to the market that harmful repair restrictions will not be tolerated. So that's exciting. We're making progress at the agency, at the federal level. Next slide. And we're also winning at the state level, right? So we've got our kind of, provinces or the equivalent in the United States. We passed a bill in New York earlier this year with incredible support, only 4 opposing votes. We're still waiting for the governor to sign that into law, which is very exciting. Colorado, we enacted a powered wheelchair right to repair bill, which is another crazy story. This is a kind of cautionary tale of what, fully monopolized repair looks like, where powered wheelchair users were often wait 4 to 6 weeks to get their chairs fixed, which means they're without mobility for 4 to 6 weeks. One respondent to our survey of folks said that if you couldn't get your car fixed for 4 to 6 weeks in the United States, there would be riots in the streets. So it just shows you the impact and the level that this is happening. And then let's go a couple ahead. I'm kind of running over on time. So, the fact of the matter is that we're not there yet. We've made some progress. We've got allies in the right places, but we still have work to do to drive this across the finish line. And so I know there is right to repair legislation and kind of tangential legislation currently before Canadian Parliament. And that is very exciting. I think it's incredibly important that you continue to work at the grassroots level to get professional societies like CMBS on board, but also getting your hospitals to submit letters of support of this legislation, because ultimately it is that bottom-up support, that bottom-up pressure that is going to make sure that we're able to, fix our devices, that you're able to fix medical equipment so that you can deliver the best care possible. So I'm going to cut it there since I am already over time, but thank you so much for all of your work. And, if you have any questions, I've got my contact information there. Additionally, you can scan that QR code to see, it's an older letter, but it will add you to our list and I'll keep you updated on the work that we're doing. So thank you so much.
That's awesome, Kevin. Thank you very much. I just saw a little question in the chat. Where is the Q&A? If you look at the top of your banner, you'll see like people, chat, raise, and then Q&A. So if you click on that, it puts you to the Q&A window. So I believe Kevin has to go a little bit early, so we're going to go do his questions first. I do want to stall for that person who asked to type in their question with this observation. 1 year's laptop fleet manufacturer worth equals 150.6 billion pounds of CO2 or 15 million cars. And yet IT calls it evergreening. So that's kind of ironic. Perhaps in the interest of time, if folks can't find the Q&A, if you want to type your question in the chat, although technically it should be over the Q&A, just so we can ask the question of Kevin as we go. Because I think one of the comments in it, some don't have the Q&A feature. So Carol, if you would like to type in your question in the chat, go for it.
And I'll also put my email in the chat. So if you want to reach out to me, please feel free to send me a note there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a standard thing. So if we can't get to your questions during the presentation, if you email it, we'll try and get an answer for you. Thank you, Kevin. There's Kevin's direct email. Here's a question over here. Can you post the QR into the chat? Yeah, I think we're still. Okay, Carol, how about we, just in the interest of time, if you can email your question and we'll make sure we get an answer for you. I want to make sure we have enough time for Dr. Wang to do his presentation. Kevin, thank you very much for your presentation. That was very interesting and very timely. As I mentioned at the top, one of the things that we do as your national clinical engineering group is that we actually have a group that's looking at right to repair, working with folks like Kevin and Binseng in order to help us do our research. Because we do actually have our own legislation that's going through Parliament, et cetera. So we want to make sure we get everyone involved in the think in order to inform that process. So with that, if there are no specific questions, and we'll do a little follow-up. Oh, I do see Carol did type in her question, and it is, can we get a list of the medical device vendors that oppose right to repair? Ooh, good question. Kevin? Did we lose Kevin?
Yeah, I think we did.
Okay, Kevin actually had another presentation that he needed to go to. So Carol and Mark, we actually, how about we follow up on your questions and we'll get back to you. And with that, I turn the floor over to Binseng.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And also, I'd like to thank Kevin, although he had to leave for a discussion at the North Carolina Assembly for his presentation, because that would save me quite a bit of time in terms of the material that he already presented. And also, I hope the manufacturers will aim their shotgun sights at him and not me, because this is becoming a little bit dangerous to my health. Okay, without further delay, let me move on. Okay, abstract in speaker information you already have, so I'm not going to waste your time there. So let me just show you the context what I'm going to talk about, and then move right on to the introduction. And this is what Kevin O'Reilly already talked about, so I'm not going to repeat all that. It's not just the freedom part, but environment, economy, and safety. The only one thing I would like to know, to call your attention is that as owners of the equipment, we can decide, they should be able to decide who and when and how we are going to fix it. However, we have to be mindful that whatever we do should not be against the law, because we don't want to put any person in a risky situation. Like, for example, if you fix your car in an inappropriate manner, you could be putting some people at jeopardy there. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to give you a brief view of the history of the right to repair, comparing the general right to repair that Kevin talked about against the medical device, and show you that there are significant parallels, but also there are independent actions going on. The right to repair for the medical side started roughly in 1996, when the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States issued the quality system regulation, and the manufacturers at that time complained that servicing was not included. And so FDA issued subsequently in 1997 a request for comments, and look at the comments and decided not to take any actions. And then finally, in 2012, the National Fire Protection Agency, many of you from Canada know that this is a very important organization in terms of standards and codes, because the codes are adoptable by federal and state governments. And one of the actions that NFPA took in that year is to require manufacturers to provide service manuals. Unfortunately, this is what is in that NFPA 99 verbiage since 2012. 2018 also had the same language. However, this is a code, as I mentioned before, can be adopted by states, but there is no enforcement of this code, and therefore manufacturers, since they are on the interstate commerce view, they say, well, we don't have to follow state requirements, and no state, to the best of my knowledge, have sought any actions to enforce this rule. So bottom line here, this is good on paper, but has not done anything really useful. In the meanwhile, the repair organizations have pushed very hard on the automobile repairs, and eventually reach a memorandum of understanding to allow the individuals as well as car repair shops to buy something called a diagnostic car code reader that you can plug into your car and get the diagnostics reading out to know what needs to be repaired. And also the cell phone part that was mentioned by Kevin, I'm not going to repeat here. So several things happened on the consumer side, but on the medical device side, the only thing we saw came up in 2016, when the FDA finally issued another request for comments for servicing of medical devices under basically the pressure of several manufacturers. I want to emphasize is not all manufacturers are forcing the FDA to review this issue, but only some. And as I mentioned before, I don't dare to mention some of their names because I have some concerns about my personal safety and well-being. And then in 2017, the Medical Device Servicing Safety Accountability Act was introduced in the Congress, but was not approved. And so it was another attempt by some manufacturers to push some regulations on medical device servicing organizations, including both in-house as well as third parties that repair medical equipment. And unhappy with the outcomes of this situation, those manufacturers went above the FDA to the Congress and forced into the verbiage of the 2017 MEDUFA Act. MEDUFA is the Medical Device User Fees Authorization that FDA gets every 5 years to collect fees from the manufacturers to then approve their devices, inspect their facilities, etc., etc. In approving the 2017 version of that law, the Congress mandated FDA to investigate a report on the safety of medical device servicing, again, because several lobbying organizations thought that was something that they need to require the FDA to do. And the FDA indeed issued a report in 2018 after years of investigation. And I'm going to show you the results, although most of you have seen that already, most likely. In parallel, the Copyright Office has issued a rule that exempted basically the copyright law protecting the access to diagnostic software, and that, as Kevin mentioned before, it was very critical for allowing pharma equipment to be serviced by others than the manufacturer themselves. At the same time, 2018, an Alliance for Quality Medical Device Servicing was formed by third parties, including Trimedics, Sodexo, Croto, Agility, and the Intermed Group today. And basically to work together, although we are all competitors to each other, but we believe this is critical for us to look into this issue. And subsequently, the FDA issued a white paper on servicing versus remanufacturing and convened a workshop on it. I'm going to go into a little more detail later, so I'm going to jump first into the FDA report. And you can download the report. It's publicly available and read that for yourselves. But the bottom line here is that most of the problems they've seen is related to so-called remanufacturing that I'm going to discuss in a few seconds. But the basic conclusion is that they have not found sufficient evidence, objective evidence, that whether there is widespread public health problems or not related to servicing, including third-party services, that would justify imposing additional different burdensome regulatory requirements at this time. So basically, FDA concluded that there are definitely problems, but there are no significant number of problems at a widespread problems, issues, concerns to justify imposing new rules that are burdensome, not only to those who service equipment, but also to the FDA itself, because FDA obviously have limited resources as well. Okay, so let's move on. And what happened next is that, as we all know and still experiencing, COVID started in many countries, and that became a really significant proof that servicing medical equipment is a critical issue. You cannot get manufacturers to come into your hospital to fix your ventilators, and what you are going to do if you don't have the access to the software, to the service manuals, test equipment, parts, etc. What you are going to do with the patients that need the ventilators, infusion pumps, etc. during that time. Okay, at that. In 2020, a piece of legislation was introduced to try to help the right to repair for medical devices, but that did not pass the Congress, so it was not voted, etc. And then, as I mentioned before, the FDA issued a draft draft guidance on remanufacturing and invited comments, and they are still working on it, and we have not finished that discussion yet. So the pandemic, as I mentioned before, became a very critical issue. It also paradoxically showed a very interesting fact that the so-called PM, preventive maintenance, actually should be called scheduled maintenance, is really not as critical, as important as many of us think, and as mandated by the government, because for most of you know better than me, many ventilators went without the so-called PMs, scheduled maintenance, during the pandemic, because there was no way to interrupt the care of the patients during that period of time. So that puts the doubt whether the PM is so critical that it needs to be 100% completed without any delays, etc., etc. Anyway, so repair.org and the US PR RG and ACCE and many other professional organizations rallied to get support for the right to repair, because we felt firsthand the challenges here. And several states, as mentioned by Kevin, tried to introduce such a law, but it has been very, very difficult. This is an example that was introduced in 2020 that was not voted because some manufacturers objected very strongly to it. And this is the list of the supporters of the bill, and including the ACCE, as well as a number of other associations and also hospitals, etc. Okay. Why I called your attention to the so-called remanufacturing draft guidance document the FDA issued and asked for comments. And bottom line here is that they drew a very nice but very complicated flow chart, and the implementation would require that after each service, even unless you follow exactly the OEM instructions, which sometimes they refuse to provide, you have to determine whether you may have violated the rules of the FDA and ventured into remanufacturing. In other words, on the shoulders of every technician that you send out to fix a piece of equipment, someone has to verify that it's not violating the rules. You have not exceeded the repair in terms of changing the specifications, the safety of the equipment, or the indication for use of that piece of equipment. This, in my view, is an impractical mandate, because that would typically, for example, for a 400-bed hospital with a 7,500 piece of equipment, that means 3,000 hours of additional work per year, or 1.5 FTE per year. That makes really something impractical for, doesn't matter whether it's a hospital or independent service organization. This is not a practical solution to this challenge here. Another important discussion that is going on currently in the United States, and hopefully you folks are aware of it, is the cybersecurity issue. And I'm not going to go into great detail about it because you probably know most of it, but I want to call your attention to something that is known as privileged access, because this is now being used as an excuse by many manufacturers to not allow the service organizations, individuals, to access the software, because they say this may create a significant challenge for the safety of the equipment, because someone can use that access to introduce malwares, ransomwares, etc., and this will have a huge impact on the downtime, because you have to wait for the manufacturer's representative to come to your organization to service the equipment. The life cycle will be shortened, because many manufacturers are saying that the equipment are so-called legacy devices that they need to be replaced There is no patching available for Windows 7, etc., etc. And there is an article that I published on the 24/7 magazine about this that you are welcome to read by itself. As Kevin mentioned, several states have been considering these type of bills, but right now we have very limited success. Massachusetts has a medical device bill in place, but the medical device was not included. Medical device was removed from the New York bill that is about to be signed into law. And in California, we had a focused bill on medical device only that was approved unanimously by the House committee, but it disappeared in the Finance Committee, not to be seen ever. I know that I'm talking about United States, but and you guys are going to be talking about other countries, but I just want to call your attention that in the European Union, this has been in place for some time, although they still have a challenge with the so-called privileged access to the diagnostic software. Another country that I encourage you to look into, paradoxically maybe, because they are the biggest manufacturer of the entire world right now, the People's Republic of China has, in their equivalent to the FDA rules, a article that requires the manufacturers to provide service information, preventive maintenance manual, corrective maintenance manual, software backup, fault code table, spare parts list, parts maintenance, passwords, etc., etc. So imagine, wouldn't it be of their interest to encourage people to dump things and buy more made in China products, but they are protecting at least their own countries, hospitals and citizens by enacting such a regulation from their equivalent FDA. Okay, so try to save time here running quickly. There are several attempts in the Congress at the present time to force some type of language into the new MEDUFA for the FDA, and again, clarifying so-called remanufacturing, and we are seeing a lot of challenge there. At the state level, we are, as Kevin said, we are having problem. And power wheelchair, obviously, it's an important piece of equipment, but in the universe of medical equipment, this is really just a drop in the bucket here, but something that you folks hopefully will pay attention. The bottom line here is that this is going to be a multi-front war at many levels, state and federal levels. And we see very clearly that this is nothing but a discussion about money, about revenue. Manufacturers are desperate to hold on to service revenue because of the pandemic. The sale of new equipment has stalled significantly. I don't know whether you have seen the news here in the United States. All the major healthcare systems are losing hundreds of millions of dollars in a single quarter. So we are talking about billions of dollars per year, and therefore no one is really buying significant amount of new equipment. And so the revenue for manufacturers has decreased very significantly. They are desperate for service revenue. So we have no choice but to fight. And at the end of the day, we don't expect to have a solution at the legislative level, but at least if we can come to a understanding with the key manufacturers, I think we can do something useful for protecting the public. And so please help us, help yourselves, and help your governments, your hospitals by fighting against this thing. And as Kevin said, it's very important to get the public involved. Here in the United States, we have even managed to convince a comedian to make an episode of his broadcast, Trevor Noah. And to the best of my understanding, you may not be able to access the YouTube section, but you can access the Facebook link to view this. But maybe if you folks have any contacts in that little country called Ukraine, I think we may be even able to invite Mr. Zelensky to help us, because I think he has been extremely effective to rally people, different countries, and perhaps in Canada as well. So thank you for your attention. I hope I have saved enough time for you to ask questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was a very, very interesting talk. Sadly, it's very much a hot topic these days. I remember, so I started my career with my internship in like 1996, entered the field in 1998. And so just in my career, it's really gone from item, like component level repair, through board level repair, through throwaway. And it's very sad that it's a lot of the times it's simply because we don't have access to the materials. Forget replacement parts. You can't even get the instructions on how to properly interrogate it. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat just yet. A very nice comment from Michael Cheng. Thank you. We'll look into that. Again, if anyone wants to pose a question, because there seems to be a little bit of an issue with the Q&A, either write it in the Q&A or the chat. I'm actually looking at both. I will definitely be looking at your link for the video for Trevor Noah. He's although he's a comedian, he seems to have some very on point comments. So that's quite interesting. The other issue that we actually do have a series of other webinars that we'll be doing through the rest of the year on cybersecurity. So it's interesting that you called out the privileged access. And that they're using that as yet another one of their excuses to simply not grant us the ability to maintain our own devices. I do see a question, two questions actually. What is the history of right to repair in Canada, as we are not under FDA? Robert, I think we'll have to follow up on this, unless, Binseng, you have some insights on the Canadian. If not, we actually can maybe address this specific question in our subsequent webinars. But first, Binseng, if you'd like to address that, if you're able.
Well, I know that there have been some efforts in some places in Canada, specifically Northern Territories. But as I said before, I consider Canada as my likely refuge in case I get hunted by the manufacturers here in the United States. So I rather abstain from answering, not to put myself in danger. But honestly, you folks know better than me what you guys are doing.
Yeah, and it's a sad fact that that's only half tongue in cheek. So I just flipped over to the Q&A. So I see, what is the history of right to repair in Canada? So we already talked about that. We talked about the list of medical device vendors that oppose right to repair. We're not going to ask that one. There's a request to post the QR into the chat, please. So the QR is listed. If you just flip to the tab on the chat, and you scroll back to Marc Ayroux, he actually provided that link in the chat.
If there is no question, I would like to make a quick comment that the issue of software control is now becoming even more significant than just servicing or repair. As some of you may have been informed by your material management colleagues in your respective hospitals, many manufacturers now are limiting your consumables to the so-called original consumers. I am aware of a particular pulse oximeter manufacturer that does not allow you to use a finger probe produced by a different manufacturer to be connected to that particular manufacturer's product. And So they are basically imitating the traditional, very old, for those of us old enough to remember, the Gillette model of shaving blades, and more recently the inkjet model. So be careful. We have experience here in the United States. Sometimes when we replace a sub-assembly of a particular piece of equipment, and the motherboard software will say, no, I don't recognize that sub-assembly unless you go into the diagnostic software and run a test. I'm not going to allow you to use the equipment. So this issue is becoming a whole lot more significant, just the service manual or tools or parts, because if you don't have access to the software, you are basically doomed here.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have time for one more question. I do see one from Adil. So he writes, from a training perspective, how does this fit into right to repair? Manufacturers should also provide that training, no? How can manufacturers know that folks have the knowledge or know-how or expertise to actually repair? Because at the end of the day, if you can't repair it, it looks bad on the manufacturer. Good point, Adil.
Not exactly, unfortunately. Actually, another rumor that I'm passing on the way I received, but it seems to have been confirmed by a few colleagues, is that here, at least in the United States, several major manufacturers have started to recruit technicians for their field service by requiring only a driver license and not even a high school diploma. As long as the person knows how to use two key tools in the eyes of the manufacturer. One is something called a laptop, and the second thing is this tool here that is called cell phone. The training they provide to this particular person is that for this person to connect the computer to the piece of medical equipment, and call up the diagnostic software, and then read the code and follow the instruction provided by the code to replace part A, part B, part C, part D, until all the parts that have been recommended, that is in this technician's hero kit that he carries in his car, is replaced. And if still does not work, then the magic tool is called technical support, and that would solve the problem. Manufacturers are doing this for two significant reasons. One is that they don't have to pay any high wages for this technician, because the person has very limited skills and knowledge. And second, more importantly, the technician can never become a competitor or go to work for a competitor to the manufacturer. So it's the easiest solution. So the old trick that we used to use, at least here in the United States, and I believe in many other countries, is to steal a service technician engineer from one of the manufacturers and then do the things by ourselves. That doesn't work anymore, because you are bringing in somebody who depends solely on that diagnostic software and a cell phone to provide service. If that does not work, tough luck. And of course, unless the equipment was incorrectly designed, replacing all the parts there, that thing has to work. And the manufacturer will say, hey, if you want a better service, sign a service contract with me, and I will station someone closer to your facility. Maybe that does not work for Kevin Taylor, because he lives in a place that to the best of my understanding, has more caribous than people. Otherwise, that's the strategy most manufacturers are taking.
Excellent comment. Yes, here in the Maritimes, we might have the same comment about fish, since most of our repair technicians, if they're not based in the Maritimes, they're coming from Toronto or something like that. I do see a couple more questions in the chat, but we are at 2:03. So I think what we'll do is we'll take note of those, and we'll send them to the presenters. and then we'll distribute those answers as a kind of a reply all to the meeting invite. So with that, I want to thank both speakers very, very much. This was an excellent first kickoff to our series of webinars on the right to repair. Lots happening behind the scenes. Again, I said we actually have a subcommittee at CMBS where we're actually looking at this. And eventually what we want to get to is how to at least support, let alone maybe have some influence on how the Canadian bill will be written to make sure that they hear our voice too. They shouldn't just hear the manufacturers who are complaining. They should hear about us, because at the end of the day, we're trying to keep Canadian citizens healthy, which I personally think trumps, but I'm a rather biased source. So again, thank you very much for both presenters, and thank you very much for you being with us today. And with that, I wish you all a happy afternoon or morning if you're on the West Coast. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.